Hi, I'm Allison Montioni, and today we're talking about scary fairies, the dark side of fairy lore. Now, most people, when they think of fairies, think of flower fairies, cute little fairies with petal skirts, sprinkling pixie dust. Maybe they think of Tinkerbell, who's mischievous but not really bad. But there are a lot of fairies who are more dangerous, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. The first story I'm going to be reading is from the book Fairies by Brian Froud and Alan Lee. This is about a duergar, which is a type of malicious dwarf found in the north of England. A story is told of a traveler who, being lost in bad weather, saw a light glimmering a short distance away. He found a rough stone hut lit by a dying fire. On either side of the fire were two stones, and nearby 2 logs. He sat on one and revived the fire with some kindling, and shortly afterwards a duergar entered and seated himself opposite the traveler. There they sat until the fire burnt down again. The duergar picked up one huge log and broke it across his knees and placed it on the fire. When it had burnt down, the duergar indicated that the traveler should put the other log on, but the traveler, suspecting a trick, did nothing. So they sat until dawn, when at once the duergar, the hut, and the fire disappeared, and the traveler found himself sitting at the edge of a tall crag. If he had moved to get the log, he would have fallen to his death. Duergars are not the only malicious type of fairy. Redcaps are one of the most dangerous fairies around. The redcap is one of the most evil of the old border goblins, that is, the goblins around the border between England and Scotland. He lives in old ruined towers and castles, particularly those with a history of wickedness. He redyes his red cap in human blood. The Lenaun She on the Isle of Man is a blood-sucking vampire, and in Ireland is the muse of poets. Those inspired by her live brilliant, though short, lives. The water leaper, also known as Llamhigan y Dŵr, is an evil creature from Welsh folklore that lives in swamps and ponds. It is described as a giant frog with a bat's wings instead of forelegs, no hind legs, and a long, lizard-like tail with a stinger at the end. It jumps across the water using its wings, hence its name. It is blamed for problems ranging from snapping fishing lines to eating livestock, and even eats fishermen. Jenny Greenteeth. There are many water spirits whose sole delight is the drowning and devouring of children. Probably most of these were invented by mothers to keep their children away from open riverbanks. The River Tees has one by the name of Peg Prowler, and a Yorkshire river is tenanted by Jenny Greenteeth. Both are green hags with long flowing hair and sharp teeth who drag their victims down to watery graves. The nuckelavee is surely the most awful of the Scottish sea fairies. A monstrous horse with legs that are part flipper, a huge mouth, and one fiery eye, and, rising from its back, joined to it at the waist, a hideous torso with arms that nearly reach the ground, topped by a massive head that rolls from side to side as though its neck was too weak to hold it upright. Worse than this, though, is the horrible appearance of the creature's flesh, for it has no skin. Black blood coursing through yellow veins, while white sinews and powerful red muscles are all exposed to view. The nuckelavee has an aversion to fresh running water, and the pursued have only to cross it to escape. His sole purpose was to plague the islanders, a task from which he rarely rests. According to the old Arcadians, who lived in constant fear of the nuckelavee, only the power of the Mither of the Sea kept the beast in check. Were it not for the fact that she restrained him in the summer, and that his terror of fresh rainwater kept him hiding in the winter, they were sure that the nuckelavee would have driven mankind from the northern isles long ago. Despite the fact that his home was considered to be the sea, the nuckelavee was known to wander freely on land. It was during these landward excursions that he most often encountered mortals, usually seen riding a steed as monstrous as himself. The nuckelavee was often blamed for numerous disasters that were known to afflict the hard-working folk of Orkney. If crops were blighted by sea gust or mildew, if livestock fell over high rocks that skirt the shores, or if an epidemic raged among men or among the lower animals, nuckelavee was the cause of it all. His breath was venom, falling like blight on vegetable and with deadly disease on animal life. Were this catalogue of misery not enough, the nuckelavee was also blamed for any droughts that could seriously ruin the harvest. The old practice of burning gathered seaweed to make kelp was said to cause terrible offense to nuckelavee. The creature could not stand the smell of the pungent smoke, and it drove him into an extreme and diabolical rage. In this state he would vent his wrath by smiting all the horses on the island of Strandzay, the island where kelp was first burned in Orkney, with a deadly disease known as mortashine. Once propagated, mortashine would soon spread throughout the islands where kelp was burned. Nuckelavee's revenge was terrible and complete. The Orkney folklorist Walter Trail Dennison, who lived in Sanday in the 19th century, claimed to know of a man who had actually encountered nuckelavee and lived to tell the tale. According to Dennison, the man was very reticent to talk on the subject, and only after much higgling and persuasion was a narrative forthcoming. And here's that story. Tamas, like his namesake Tam O'Shanter, was out late one night. It was, though moonless, a fine starlit night. Tamas's road lay close by the seashore, and as he entered a part of the road that was hemmed in on one side by the sea, and on the other by a deep freshwater loch, he saw some huge object in front of and moving towards him. What was he to do? He was sure it was no earthly thing that was steadily coming towards him. He could not go to either side, and to turn his back to an evil thing he had heard was the most dangerous position of all. So Tammy said to himself, "The Lord be about me, and take care of me, as I am out on no evil intent this night." Tammy was always regarded as rough and foolhardy. Anyway, he determined, as the best of two evils, to face the foe, and so walked resolutely yet slowly forward. He soon discovered to his horror that the gruesome creature approaching him was no other than the dreaded nuckelavee, the most cruel and malignant of all uncanny beings that trouble mankind. The lower part of this terrible monster, as seen by Tammy, was like a great horse, with flappers like fins about his legs, with a mouth as wide as a whale's, from which came breath like steam from a brewing kettle. He had but one eye, and that as red as fire. On him sat, or rather seemed to grow from his back, a huge man with no legs, and arms that reached nearly to the ground. His head was as big as a clew of Simmons, and this huge head kept rolling from one shoulder to the other as if it meant to tumble off. But what to Tammy appeared most horrible of all was that the monster was skinless, this utter want of skin adding much to the terrific appearance of the creature's naked body. The whole surface of it showing only red, raw flesh, in which Tammy saw blood, black as tar, running through yellow veins, and great white sinews, thick as horse tethers, twisting, stretching, and contracting as the monster moved. Tammy went slowly on in mortal terror, his hair on end, a cold sensation like a film of ice between his scalp and his skull, and a cold sweat bursting from every pore. But he knew it was useless to flee, and he said if he had to die, he would rather see who killed him than die with his back to his foe. In all his terror, Tammy remembered what he had heard of nuckelavee's dislike of fresh water, and therefore took that side of the road nearest the loch. The awful moment came when the lower head of the monster got abreast of Tammy. The mouth of the monster yawned like a bottomless pit. Tammy found its hot breath like fire on his face. The long arms were stretched out to seize the unhappy man. To avoid, if possible, the monster's clutch, Tammy swerved out as near as he could to the loch. In doing so, one of his feet went into the loch, splashing up water onto the foreleg of the monster, whereat the horse gave a snort like thunder. and shied over to the other side of the road, and Tammy felt the wind of the nuckelavee's clutches as he narrowly escaped the monster's grip. Tammy saw his opportunity and ran with all his might, and sore need had he to run, for nuckelavee had turned and was galloping after him and bellowing with a sound like the roaring of the sea. In front of Tammy lay a rivulet, through which the surplus water of the loch found its way to the sea, and Tammy knew if he could only cross the running water he was safe, so he strained every nerve. As he reached the near bank another clutch was made at him by the long arms. Tammy made a desperate spring, and reached the other side, leaving his bonnet in the monster's clutches. Nuckelavee gave a wild, unearthly yell of disappointed rage as Tammy fell senseless on the safe side of the water. Now, brownies are a type of household fairies. They usually help people with chores and will do various tasks in return for a saucer of milk or something like that. However, if a brownie is offended, their wrath can become terrible, as in this story of Fincastle Mill. One of the best known of the Highland brownies is Meg, or Maggie Moolach. Meg had a son, Brownie Claude, who, however, was a Dobie, a rather stupid variety of brownie. One tale tells of a certain Fincastle Mill that was reputed to be haunted, so no one dared set foot there after dark. One night, however, a girl who was making a cake for her wedding discovered that she had run short of meal. Finding no one willing to go to the mill for her, she had to go herself. She made up a big fire, put a pot of water on to boil, and began to grind the meal. On the dot of midnight, an ugly little brown man came into the mill, edged towards her, and when she asked who he was, replied by asking what her name was. She answered, "Oh, I'm Mees me Fane," which means me myself. The brownie edged closer to her, leering in an unpleasant manner, until she took fright and poured a ladle of boiling water over him. At this he screeched in anger and flew at her. She defended herself by pouring the rest of the boiling water over him. He fled out of the door, mortally burned, to Maggie Moolach, who asked him who was responsible for hurting him in this way. He replied that it was me myself. But the girl did not escape Maggie's wrath for long. Some time later, when she was married, she was asked to tell a story, so she recounted how she had tricked the brownie at Fincastle Mill. Unbeknown to her, Maggie Moolach was outside and heard every word, and she took her revenge immediately, throwing a three-legged stool so violently at the young bride that she was killed on the spot. Maggie Moolach then found a new home near a farm, where the servants paid her with bread and cream for her help. She worked so conscientiously, however, that the farmer decided to dismiss all the servants and rely on her work. He retaliated by going on strike and becoming a full-time boggart, plaguing him so much that he was forced to rehire the rest of his servants. And a boggart is a mischievous type of fairy that will cause all kinds of mischief, and sometimes it will cause even harm to people in the house where it lives. In Ireland, there are many places that look like big circles of trees or raised hillocks in the ground, and those are called fairy forts or raths. And it is told that you should never ever disturb a fairy fort or break off the trees from inside it, for if you do, the fairies will take revenge on you. These stories were collected by Eddie Lenihan, who's an Irish folklorist. They were mostly collected in Southern Ireland in the 90s and early 2000s. So these stories were all told by people who were living in Ireland at the time. Long ago, the Tuatha De Danann, that is, the people of the other worlds, the children of the goddess Danu, and the Fair Bolg, a people who reputedly inhabited Ireland in ancient times, and all those tribes used to have fights, and after one of those battles, the crowd that lost, I don't know, was it the Fair Bolg or the Tuatha De Danann, retreated into the spirit world, and they are the fairies today. As we know, the spirit world lives forever. That is why they were before Christ, and they wouldn't have entered the eternal mansions when the spirits moved over. 'Tis because their spirits stayed around their own property. They still hadn't been converted to Christianity. And that is why the fairy raths, or forts, or whatever people want to call them, people feel that they're protected. Their property is still protected. I'll tell you this story now. One night we were visiting this local man. He had got a bad bout of sickness. There was three of us, and the three of us had fairy forts on our land. Of course, naturally, the discussion turned to the forts. Well, I said, I never interfered with it at all, never touched it. It was there thousands of years before I came, and hopefully 'twill be there thousands of years when I'm gone. I wouldn't interfere with their property at all, at all. And the other man that was there, he said, well, I cut the bushes out of it, all right, but I left the rings there. And the third man came in and said, I brought in the bulldozer and made the fairies homeless. He was laughing at the idea, thought 'twas a big joke. I said, watch it there now, Pat. They'll make you homeless. In 1 week, a shed fell on him and killed him. In 1 week! That was a Sunday night we spoke. The following Sunday, the shed fell on him. And the other lad was dead one morning when his wife woke. He was dead alongside her. I'm the only survivor of the group. This story is called The Man in the Coffin. You often heard it said, did you, that there's no luck in interfering with forts? I heard that myself, and I'd believe it, too. There was these two men living near Quinn one time. Poor men. They had only the grass of a cow each. They were next-door neighbors. We'll call 'em Sean and Pat. And there was nothing they liked better than to go out hunting in the fall of the year, when all the leaves were gone, and they could see what they were doing, you know. But they had only the one old gun between them. 'Twas Sean had it, and Pat'd go with him just for the company, any time the day was fine in the month of September or October. You'd often get a nice hearty spell of weather at that time of year. So this Sunday they were out, 'twas in the start of October, and they were off after walking miles, and shot nothing. Didn't even see a rabbit or a pheasant. Nothing. They didn't mind, though. 'Twas a grand fine day for being out, and they met several people to talk to on the way. In the evening, anyway, they were coming back, chatting away, Sean with the gun over his shoulder. And they were passing Corbelly Fort. It was there on the hill overhead 'em, a big double-ring fort about 1.5 miles from the village. And when Sean looked up, didn't he see a white thing above on one of the bushes in the fort? Lord God, look, says he, look at the goose. And he loaded up the gun quick and fired. Sure enough, he hit it, 'cause he saw the feathers scattering and the bird falling down through the branches. But Pat was looking at him. What are you talking about? Says he. I don't see nothing. Sean wasn't listening to him at all, only in over the ditch with him and off up the hill to get the goose. But when he came above the fort and reached in under the bush where the bird was, the feathers was scattered now, and plenty blood around. There was nothing there when he touched it, only stuff like frog spawn. 'Twas like jelly. Well, he pulled his hand back from it, like he was burned, but the stuff stuck to him, and even already 'twas turning black. He tried to wipe it off, but no, he couldn't. Come out of it, says Pat to him. Why did you fire into the fort? They went back to Quinn, to their own places, and they didn't see each other any more that evening. But the following morning Pat was up early. 'Twas a grand fine morning. And what he'd usually do on a morning like that, he'd stand at the door and smoke his pipe and be looking around him, and usually Sean'd be doing the same next door. But this morning there was no sign of Sean. The door was closed. Begod, that's queer, says Pat. He'd be there if 'twas raining. After he had a drop of tea and there was still no sign of Sean, he said to himself he might as well wander over and knock, just in case. You wouldn't do that at a neighbor's house today, or you'd be nearly took up for trespassing. But there was nature in them days, when people had nothing. And now it's a different world entirely, boy. He went over anyway and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still no answer. So he tried the latch. Door locked. Begod, that's strange, says he. Because in them days, no one used to lock doors. No poor people, anyway. 'Cause what had they to steal? So he went around the end of the house and looked in the bedroom window. There was no curtain. Sean wasn't a married man, no more than himself, and you know the way 'tis with old bachelors now. The last thing that'd be worrying them is something like curtains. So he peeped in the room window, and, Lord save us, what did he see inside the bed? Only Sean, and every bone in his body twisted. That's what it looked like. Hands, legs, neck, and even his mouth and eyes. Pat, he tried everything he could to open up the window, but it failed him. He had to get a stone and break the glass to go in. And when he faced the man inside the bed, sure, Sean wasn't even able to talk, only croaking. "Don't stir, don't make one move," says Pat. "I'll get the doctor." That's what he did, into Tula as fast as he could, and they came back together. Well, the doctor only took one look at him in the bed, and he said, "'Tis the hospital for you, poor man." They lifted him into the doctor's sidecar and off to Tula. The hospital was at Gurarach, outside the village. 'Twas a workhouse, but sure, they're the kind of places that poor people had to go in that time. The people hated him, especially after the famine, but what could they do? So Sean was landed in Gurarach anyway, and when they arrived he was put into this big room by himself. And I suppose the only reason he was alone was that 'twasn't right winter yet. If 'twas the month of December now, that place would be full. Anyway, he was left there, and Pat says to him before he went home, "Don't worry about the cow or anything. I'll mind her. You'll be out in a couple days." So the night came, but he couldn't sleep. Would you be surprised at that? And the moon came up, and 'twas shining in the small windows. They were up at the top of the wall, near the roof. Oh, the lads that built them places, they didn't build 'em for your comfort or so that you'd be looking at the flowers. And Sean, he was watching it. 'Twas about all he could watch. And then all of a sudden, sometime in the small hours, he heard this scratching noise down along from him, below in a corner. And the first thought that came to him was that 'twas rats. And Lord God, if they attacked you, they'd eat you alive, man. He couldn't move, only his head and eyes. But by God, when he did, he saw enough. And 'twasn't rats he saw either, only worse. 'Cause there, coming through the wall at the far end of the room, was a leg. And another one next to it, and another, and another. 4 of 'em, in through the wall, side by side. But that was only the start of it. Slowly and slowly they came in, the legs and then the rest of the bodies, until he saw the elbows and the hands. And 'twas then he saw the end of the coffin, coming in through the wall too, and that wall was built of stone, at least 2 feet thick. And all he could do was try to cover himself up with his blanket, but he couldn't. His hands wouldn't work. They came in, and a third man holding the coffin behind. They started walking up the floor towards him, and he could hear every creak of every floorboard under him. Sure, he was near wetting the bed with fright. When they came to where he was, they put the coffin down next to the bed, and one of 'em he started to unscrew the screws at the 4 corners of it. He pulled off the cover then, and he says, "Look what you did when you fired into Corbelly Fort." Sean, all he could do was look down out of the corner of his eye, but he could see enough. 'Cause inside the coffin was a man, all covered with blood from his feet up to his head, like he was shot. "That's what you did to our brother when you fired into our house. And listen now, and listen carefully. If you don't get out of that bed this minute and pick every single shot out of our brother before the sun comes up, you'll be in that coffin with him, and we'll let the 2 of you sort out your differences, after we screw on the cover again." By the way the 3 of 'em were looking at him, he knew full well they were in earnest, but he was still crippled, so all he could do was roll out of the bed, out on the floor, and start rooting around in the dead man, trying to find all them pellets. And sure, it was like handling dead meat, but he had to do it. They were standing there around him, watching him. Hour after hour he stuck at it, and the nearer 'twas getting to daylight, the more they were getting impatient. "Hurry on! Hurry up!" and on like that. 'Twas just close before dawn, and didn't he find the last of the shot, someplace in the man's neck it was. But if he thought his troubles were over, they were only starting, 'cause at that very minute the lad inside the coffin, his 2 eyes opened, and he started to rise up. Indeed, when Sean saw that, I tell you he wasn't long getting back his movement. He made a dive under the bed and tried his level best to get out through the wall, but no hope. The man stood up and came out on the floor. Sure, his 3 brothers had a great welcome for him, naturally. "Where's the wretch that shot me?" says he. "Show me him." They all pointed in under the bed where Sean was. "What'll we do with him?" said the lad. "We'll carry him away with us," says one of 'em. "Wouldn't he be handy for carrying the coffin?" Him? A man that'd fire into a fort? Sure, a man like him has no religion at all. He'd be handy all the same. He wouldn't. He would. He would not. And the argument started. For a finish they were nearly coming to blows about it, until one of them looked up and noticed that 'twas very nearly daylight. "Ah! Look! Quick!" And like that, they clapped the cover on the coffin up on their shoulders with it, and out through the wall, the very same way as they came in. But do you think Sean came out from under the bed? Indeed he didn't. And he was still there at 8:30 when the matron came in with the surgeon. Of course, as soon as they opened the door, the surgeon says to her, "I thought you told me you had a patient for me." "Well, he was here last night, doctor. Whatever happened to him?" But of course Sean, under the bed, as soon as he saw the legs at the door, he thought 'twas the lads back again for him. All he did was to make one buck leap out between the doctor's legs, out the door, and legged it. He never stopped until he got to Ennis, and he didn't even stop there, only kept going till he came to the pier at Clare Castle. There was a boat there just about to sail for Limerick, and he jumped into it, caught a hold of the mast, and no amount of 'em could let go. Pure terror. For a finish, the captain said to leave him there, or they'd missed the tide. That's how he got to Limerick. And he got going from there to America. Worked his passage, I suppose, like a lot more. And I heard he did well in America, too. Got married there. Had a family. But never came back. And do you know why? 'Cause if he ever set foot in Ireland again, you know who'd be waiting for him, don't you? That's right, the three of 'em, and their box. And the second time, they'd make no mistake. Thank you for joining me for today's story session. This program is part of the Mohawk Valley Library System's program, Fairies and Gnomes Imagine Their Homes. You can find out more at 518fairiehomes.com or visit the Facebook page 518 Fairy Homes. Thank you and enjoy your day.